Well, thank you for staying with us. The African continent is set to outperform the rest of the world in the economic growth over the next 2 years, with real gross domestic product averaging around 4% in 2023 and 2024. This is higher than projected global averages of 2.7% and 3.2%. The African Development Bank Group revealed this, its Africa Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook reports for the region. With a comprehensive regional growth analysis, the report shows that the continent's 5 regions remain resilient with steady outlook for the medium term, despite facing significant headwinds due to global socioeconomic shocks. However, the report sends a cautionary note on the outlook following current global and regional risk. Let's discuss this and, of course, put this into the right perspective. I'm being joined via Zoom by partner tax reporting and strategy at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Mr. Kenneth Erikume. It's good to see you in 2023.
Happy New Year to Lou. Nice to see you as well. We haven't spoken for a while.
Yeah.
Nice to catch up.
Yeah, indeed. This report from the AFDB looks like a good one, considering what we've seen before now, IMF, World Bank, and all of that. But AFDB is saying that African countries are resilient and they're going to do better and even outperform some other countries. How does this report come to you? What do you make of it?
All right, thank you very much, Tolu. I think the IMF also clarified not too long ago in Davos that they were not projecting or predicting a global recession. What they said is that a third of countries will be in recession. And that was largely because of the 3 major markets, the US, Europe, and China, and some of the challenges, being witnessed that we saw in 2022, which is expected to also extend into 2023. Europe in particular will continue to struggle with gas prices and cost of energy because of the lingering Russia and Ukraine war. And because of that, there's an expectation that the growth in many markets across the world will not be significant, as seen in the current projections, both by the World Bank and by the Africa Development Bank. Now, what the African Development Bank is saying is that despite the challenges we're seeing globally, in terms of global demands and the decline, as we witness in the growth, the lack of growth in many of those major markets, the inflationary pressures, because central banks across the world are still trying to ensure that they manage this thing called inflation, and of course the disruption to supply chains. So despite those shocks, it's still expected that Africa will continue to grow. And when you look at Africa and you profile Africa, by the way, into the various regions, it's expected that East Africa will continue to grow moderately. There's not going to be significant decline in terms of their growth because they have a largely diversified economy. As they play across different commodities in agriculture, services, and tourism. So they have a resilient economy. In West Africa, where we have the biggest, market in terms of GDP, which is Nigeria, there's an expectation that some of the initiatives around curbing oil theft will now begin to crystallize in 2023. And begin to see some of those benefits. Now, we all know that, even though oil and gas is the major FX earner for Nigeria, it doesn't contribute much in terms of GDP. However, there are a lot of dependent industries that rely on oil and gas to thrive, from housing to services, to banking and so on. So when the government begins to get it right, as we saw towards the end of last year, and we're able to increase production, there's an expectation that this will trickle down in the economy. And Nigeria would still expect some growth. Now, having said that, I just use that as an indication of the West African market. Having said that, we should not ignore that this GDP growth and growth in Africa cannot be looked at in isolation, because a lot of the countries in Africa have huge debt profile. And what we anticipate in 2023 is that the US will continue to manage inflation, especially where they mentioned that they would slow down how they're hiking the interest rates, but there's an expectation that they would continue to increase it moderately, or that we may see one or two increases, but slower than what we saw last year. So with that sort of stability of the US dollar, the US dollar will continue to be strong, and that has a counter effect on many developing countries that rely on importation, because the cost of importing those goods, whether they be raw materials or finished goods, would be significant, and that will continue to drive inflation in Africa. And in the same vein, many of these developing countries, especially in Africa, are exposed to foreign loans, and as long as interest rates continue to go up, and the US dollar continues to be strong, many of these countries would still have a challenge in servicing those foreign debts. So a lot still needs to be done, despite the projections from the Africa Development Bank. A lot of things still needs to happen from a policy perspective, and a lot of things still needs to happen from a fiscal management perspective.
Great stuff. Now, when you, of course, I'm a journalist and I'll do the asking of the questions. When you talk more about growth rates, there is this argument with economists that something like you need to grow as well as the way you're higher than your population growth. Yes, that's where I'm going. Because if you don't grow at that pace, more people continue to drift into poverty line. That is a given. Now, what sort of growth do we now need to get that inclusiveness that we want? Not an exclusive kind of growth, but an inclusive kind of growth. What are those steps that can be taken? Because in all of this good news, caution still runs in the ride-up.
Yes, Tolu. And while you see, when we were analyzing the growth rate, we were doing it in relative terms. So how is Africa going to perform compared to the rest of the world? And when we pick Nigeria in isolation, there's an expectation that the growth rate is not going to be more than 4%. It's going to be 3 point something. That sort of growth rate, in terms of the trajectory, is running slower than population growth. And effectively, what that means is that the GDP per capita, which is the GDP per citizen in the country, will drop because you're dividing by a higher number and a faster growth rate of the population. And this is why, was it last year or 2 years ago, Nigeria caught up with India and overtook India in terms of, people label it the poverty capital of the world. And that's instructive, because for us to actually get people out of poverty, we need to grow faster than population. And that would require us to be growing at double digits. Unfortunately, this is not the time for anybody across the world to be projecting double-digit growth rate, because it's literally impossible. When you consider that there's still a bit of uncertainty, despite the opening up of China, there's still uncertainty on how that will pan out in terms of global trade. The big markets where you can find a home for your products, your services, your goods, are not going to be growing astronomically. Therefore, demand is not going to increase significantly. So the reality is that we are where we are, but government needs to think about medium term and long term around putting in place policies. And one of the predictions that economists are talking about is that because of the limited growth that you see across different locations, there'll be more political tension and pressure. And it's really not good news for the World Trade Organization, and it's really not good for globalization, because what you will tend to see is a lot of inward looking by countries to see how they can optimize value from what they already have internally. And Nigeria will not be separated from that. We need a long-term strategy to ask ourselves, what do we want to be known for in the long term, and play to our strengths in that regard. So the double digit is not going to happen today. It's not going to happen in 2023. I doubt it will happen in 2024. But if we put in place the right policies and with the right leadership, and I think from a political perspective, we now need to be asking candidates, at the presidency level, at the governorship level, what sort of policies are they coming in, will they be putting in place from an economic perspective to stimulate production and ensure that this our growing population were able to improve wealth and grow the wealth for the collective Nigerian.
Great stuff. Mr. Paul, let me follow up with part of the good news is you talked about crude oil theft. NNPCL is doing a lot to see how we can improve revenue from that one way or the other, which will help augment government spending. But breaking news before I came on set shows that the FRS has generated an all-time high of 10.1 trillion naira. All of those news will still be so that's what we have. Non-oil tax about 5.96 trillion naira. But my question is, are we addressing those structural issues around our tax reforms, digitalizing our tax reform, that can make us more transparency, and maybe we can also get more money from here, at least to pay some of our debts?
Yeah, so I think, like I always say, the quick win short-term strategy that we have adopted is not sustainable. And you could see some of that come through in the finance bill, which the president has not yet assented to. There was a lot of focus in terms of revenue generation, so there was a proposal to impose excise on all services. There was a proposal to increase education tax from 2.5% to 3%. There are proposals to introduce a gas flaring tax of 50%, and so on and so forth. Those sort of strategies are not going to work. And this is me just saying that bluntly. For you to actually optimize revenue, you have to stimulate the economy. And there are some things that play to our strength. And if you look at the Africa Development Bank's press release as well, there was a mention of Mozambique and Senegal and how they've been able to attract investment in gas infrastructure. They didn't do that just by the stick. They incentivized that industry. And when you look at what gas is able to achieve from a Nigerian perspective, because that's a resource we have to play with, I think we should be doing more in terms of policy. Some of the recent policies we're seeing, where you have the gas flaring penalties, but then you're introducing a 50% corporate companies income tax on gas flaring. Rather than saying if you invest in gas infrastructure, will give you incentives similar to what was given to NLNG. It's interesting that since NLNG, a lot of the gas projects that we could have that could have come up, like the Olokola or the Brass LNG, those projects have not seen final investment decision. So we need to now start looking at how we can optimize, especially in this time where Europe is looking for alternative sources for energy. Oil should still be a major player or a major focus for us. Like I always say, the energy transition is before us. So we now need to start thinking how we can incentivize and extract the crude and monetize the crude within a very short period of time. And of course, agriculture. When you look at our neighbors, Ghana is a big player in cocoa, and then you look at Ivory Coast, also a big player in cocoa, and we have palm oil. Agriculture is one of the areas that government needs to not just be a policy maker, but now start looking at public-private partnerships, in order to optimize the value which we have in arable land. So when you do those things, the rest will follow. Of course, government still needs to focus a lot, because when you're increasing taxes, what you're doing is you're taxing the people who are already in tax net. So you're killing them and snuffing out the life from them. But what government needs to do is to ensure that they widen that base as against increasing taxes. And I've said this time without number. There is a large informal sector in Nigeria, and this is not unusual. We have large informal sectors in many developing countries. Can we pick India as a case study? What did they do in India around identity management and using technology to ensure that every single revenue that is due to government is captured? Those are the things I think we can do in order to ensure that we are able to service the debt and perhaps pay back in the near future.
Time fast spent. But I wanted us to wrap up staying with that gas issue which you talked about. I thought the PIA was to address some of these issues. What are the goodies in the PIA to attract investment into that sector? We can close on that note. 2 minutes.
Yeah, so the PIA introduced an additional 5 years tax holiday for investment in gas infrastructure. And I believe strongly that the PIA has done its job, right? The next thing that needs to happen is for us to then ensure that we do not have policies that are changing overnight, like what we see in terms of the proposal in the finance bill, to then introduce a gas flaring tax. And we should also remember that a lot of the gas is in associated gas. So you cannot just then introduce new policies to destroy or create problems for the oil industry as well. So those are some of the things that we did not see. Of course, the lack of consistency. So, for example, the industry is asking questions. Why would you just pass the PIA yesterday, and with the finance bill, you want to introduce new tax rules for the oil and gas industry? Investors don't like that. Where today it is one thing, tomorrow is another. And of course, the elephant in the room, which is the removal of fuel subsidy. So big question: why would we lock up upwards of 4 or 5 or 6 trillion naira in payment of subsidy when the PIA already said that it should be removed a long time ago? So those are some of the things which, from a policy perspective, I think the PIA has addressed. But in terms of implementation, we haven't done quite well in implementing what has been codified in the Petroleum Industry Act.
Mr. Kenneth Erikume is our partner, tax reporting and strategy at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you so much for joining us this Monday afternoon. Do enjoy the rest of your day at work.
Thank you very much.